At a national leadership conference, my brother raised his glass. Some people dream, some people build, and some just watch. I smiled coldly. 26 years later, I bankrupted every venture with slow precision, lured away every partner, exposed every hidden scandal. His great-grandchildren are currently suing for the right to legally sever ties to the family name, and history classes teach about his downfall as the blueprint for how to destroy an empire in one generation. I never forgot that night. It was late summer, 1999, and we were in Philadelphia for the National Leadership Conference. The kind of place where men wore $2,000 suits and women smiled with their teeth, but never with their eyes. It was held at the Marriott downtown ballroom, packed. Tables lined with crystal glasses, fake smiles, and a whole lot of people who'd chew you up if you showed weakness. My brother Mason was the keynote speaker. He stood there, standing tall with that clean-cut billionaire look, same one he'd always had. Trimmed beard, expensive watch, confidence that came with knowing everyone in the room owed him something or wanted something from him. I stood in the back corner. Not because I wasn't invited to sit up front. I was. But I'd learned a long time ago that Mason's spotlight had rules. And standing too close to him made you a target. I kept my hands in my pockets and waited for him to say what he always said. But then he raised his glass, smiled, and dropped the words I'd never forget. Some people dream, he said with that voice that could sell God a pen. Some people build, and some just watch. The crowd laughed. It wasn't a joke to me. He was staring straight at me when he said it. That little flicker in his eyes gave him away. He wanted me to feel small in that room. He wanted to humiliate me publicly, cleanly, and with a smile that made it all seem friendly. I smiled back. Not warmly, not politely. I just stared at him, and for the first time I realized exactly who my brother was. And I made a decision right then and there. I was going to watch. And then I was going to wait. And one day I was going to tear him apart. Mason was 8 years older than me. We had the same father, different moms. He grew up in Chicago with his mom, going to private schools and summer leadership camps. I grew up in Omaha with mine, mostly just trying to keep the lights on. We weren't close, but Dad made us stay in touch. Every summer I got sent to spend a few weeks with Mason's family. I'd sit in his pool house while he ran meetings in his dad's study. Even as teenagers, he was the boss. I was the quiet one, the good listener, the helper. When Dad passed, Mason inherited the lion's share. I got some cash, enough for a car and an apartment, and a generic, "you'll figure it out" nod. I didn't ask for more. I didn't expect more. I went to community college, then bounced around doing contract work. Mason started his first company, Hero Transport, and made sure I knew he didn't need help. Then around 1996 he called me, told me I could work in one of his offices in Dallas. I said sure. He gave me a desk in the back corner of a warehouse. I sorted invoices, labeled crates, answered phones when someone called out sick. I never complained. I showed up on time every time. 3 years later he fired me, told me I wasn't built for this game. Then came the toast. The years after that were hard. I won't lie. I drifted. I worked construction in Tulsa, data entry in Albuquerque. I even stocked shelves at a chain store in Reno for a while. I didn't touch my inheritance, I wanted to make it without it. But something inside me had changed. I started watching Mason from a distance. He moved fast, grew Hero Transport into a national force, then pivoted to energy logistics. He opened a tech firm that built warehouse tracking systems. He spoke at investor conferences, got invited to TV panels, married a TV anchor, then a model, then someone's daughter from a DC family. And the more I watched him, the more I saw the cracks. Mason was charming, smart, but he burned bridges fast. Partners would vanish. Employees would get quietly paid off. His companies would rebrand every couple of years like he was hiding from something. So I started collecting. Not pictures or gossip, real stuff. Public filings, press releases, lawsuits, SEC update, property purchases, offshore bank leaks. And every time Mason launched something new, I noted who he was working with. Took years, but I was patient. And then, around 2009, I met the first person who really wanted to help me. Sean Buckley was a former partner of Mason's. I found him through an old legal brief tied to a failed warehouse project in Utah. He was bitter, divorced, and very open to payback. I didn't tell him who I was at first. Just said I had info on Harrow's holdings. He invited me to meet in a tiny steakhouse outside Austin. I showed him a thick folder of cross-company ownership records, offshore accounts, and patent filings tied to Mason's name. He stared at it, then looked up and said, "You know, I thought I was the only one who wanted this guy to choke." That was the beginning. We created a holding company, Crossline Growth Partners, and used it to quietly buy into Mason's supply chain. Not the big stuff. Small vendors. Mid-size firms that fed his infrastructure. Slowly, carefully, we poisoned the well. Delays started hitting his companies. Lawsuits popped up over broken contracts. Cash flow issues rolled in. By 2016, one of Mason's biggest ventures, Transtar Freight, started bleeding out. Their stock tanked after a failed acquisition. The press started asking questions. And then I leaked the first internal emails. It wasn't even that bad. Just a few notes showing that Mason had pushed out a whistleblower. But that crack was enough. Journalists started digging. They found a few settlements. Then some shady payment routing through a shell firm in Florida. I fed them just enough to keep going. In 2018, I hit the gas. I leaked a massive spreadsheet to ProPublica showing that Mason was hiding investor losses in a side account managed by one of his college friends. The IRS got involved. Mason tried to lie, then tried to settle. It didn't work. That December, federal agents raided one of his storage facilities. It made national news. I watched the broadcast from a motel in Colorado Springs. I had pizza on my lap and a six-pack beside me. The ticker on the screen read, "Federal raid tied to Harrow Logistics investigation." I sent Mason a card. Just 2 words. "Still watching." Now he knew. But he still didn't know how deep I'd gone. His third wife left him in 2019. Said in court filings that he wasn't the man she thought he was. His son's new app venture collapsed after I slipped a small patent lawsuit into the works. His daughter dropped out of business school. Changed her last name. In 2021, one of his old execs admitted Mason had covered up a fatal warehouse accident back in 2003. Settlements started draining what was left of his fortune. And all I did was keep pushing. Every partner he reached out to, I got there first. Every comeback plan he had, I kneecapped it before launch. Every speech he tried to book, canceled. Every investor pitch, I made sure they had a file. By 2023, the story of Mason Harrow had become a case study. Forbes called it the fastest corporate fall in a decade. A university in Michigan taught a class titled, "The Harrow Collapse: Ambition Without Accountability." His great-grandchildren, they exist, are now legally trying to change their last name. They want nothing to do with him. And me? I'm still here, living in a quiet little house in Flagstaff. I don't go out much. I keep a low profile. But I've got boxes of documents stacked neatly in my garage. Labeled, indexed, cross-referenced. This was never about revenge in the traditional sense. I didn't want to see him cry. I didn't want to see him jailed. I wanted to erase him. I wanted to rewrite the legacy he thought was untouchable. And I did. Piece by piece. I thought I was finished. I'd brought Mason down. I'd stripped him of everything he built, made him a ghost in the same circles where he once ruled. I figured he'd crawl away somewhere warm and quiet, maybe Costa Rica or some private island he had stashed under a dummy company. I expected silence. But I didn't get silence. I got a phone call. It was October 2023. I was sitting in my backyard, watching the sky go orange over the red rocks. The number wasn't familiar. Arizona area code. I usually let unknown numbers go to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Hello." Long pause. Then a voice I hadn't heard in over a decade. "You're not as invisible as you think you are," Mason said. My stomach didn't drop. My hand didn't shake. I just leaned back in the chair and let him talk. "You made your point," he said. "You won. You could have left it there." "You're still breathing," I said. He laughed. It was a dry old laugh. Sounded like a man who'd smoked through every loss. "Is this about Dad?" he asked. About the will? About that job? You're still chasing that after all these years. I didn't say anything. He said, you think you were smarter than me. But you weren't. You were just quiet. Quiet people are good at waiting. But they don't lead. You just waited for someone else to fall. Then he hung up. I expected him to lash out. Go public. Play the victim. Try to shift the narrative. But he didn't. He did something worse. He disappeared. No trace. No interviews. No angry letters. Just gone. At first, I figured he was hiding, maybe trying to regroup. But after 3 months of no activity, no account movement, no contact with his lawyers, I got worried. Then I got a visit. It was New Year's Eve 2023. I was pulling into the driveway when a dark blue SUV rolled in behind me. 2 men stepped out. Mid-50s. Clean haircuts. Plain jackets. Federal types. They showed me their badges. Department of Justice. They said Mason was under federal investigation for fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction. But he hadn't shown up to his last hearing. They were trying to track him down. I played dumb. Said I hadn't spoken to him in years. One of them, a guy named Devereaux, gave me a long look and said, if anything comes to mind, anything at all, you call me. They handed me a card. I burned it that night. A week later, I got an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a photo. It was a picture of me, taken from a parking lot in downtown Flagstaff. I was walking out of the grocery store. Someone had drawn a red X over my head. No note. No message. Just that. I didn't panic. I'd lived too long in the shadows to be afraid of them. But I did something I hadn't done in years. I dug up my old files. Not the ones about Mason. The ones I'd kept on myself. Alias names. Old apartment records. Burner phone history. Past travel. I wanted to make sure I hadn't left a breadcrumb trail for someone to follow back. But as I combed through my digital folders, something stood out. There was a login to one of my dummy LLC bank accounts from a location in Marietta, Georgia. 2 weeks earlier. I never went to Georgia. Someone had gotten in. And not just to that account. Over the next few days, I watched as 3 of my backup email accounts were accessed. 2 of the burner phones I had stashed across state lines were turned off remotely. And the secure cloud folder I kept on Mason's financial network gone. Just like that. I'd always been careful. I used military-grade encryption. Changed passwords weekly. Nothing was connected to my real name. But this wasn't a regular breach. This was personal. And there was only one person who could do it. Mason wasn't rebuilding his empire. He was trying to erase me. The next hit came fast. A news article popped up in a small online outlet in Austin. Headline: Ex-associate tied to Harrow collapse may have operated fraud network. They used my old alias, David Crenshaw. It was buried in the business section. No major outlet picked it up. But the article had enough detail, just enough to scare me. Dates, movements, company names that had never been public. Somebody was feeding the press. And the only place they could have gotten that info was from my own system. That meant Mason wasn't just lashing out. He was hunting me. And he wasn't doing it alone. I went off the grid after that. Wiped all digital traces. Scrubbed my devices. Switched locations. I moved to a cabin I owned under an alias up in Montana, near a place called Seeley Lake. It was cold, quiet, isolated. For the first time in over 20 years, I wasn't on offense anymore. I was watching my back. Then I found the leak. An old partner, not Sean, but someone else from a minor phase of the Crossline expansion, had flipped. Sold me out for immunity. I don't know how Mason got to him. Maybe money. Maybe blackmail. But it didn't matter. He gave Mason the roadmap. Names. Paths. Weak spots. Mason had gone underground, sure. But from the shadows, he was trying to take everything from me. Not just my operation. My name. My safety. My life. This wasn't about business anymore. This was personal. I had thought revenge would end with his collapse. But now I saw it for what it was, a war. And if he wanted to drag this into the dirt, I was ready. Because I didn't just destroy empires. I erased legacies. And I wasn't done yet. I stayed in Montana longer than I'd planned. The cabin I used was one I'd bought under a shell company 6 years ago, just in case I ever needed to vanish. No neighbors for miles. Wood burning stove. Satellite internet that I only powered up when I needed to run checks. No social media. No utilities in my name. But isolation messes with your mind. You start running scenarios. What if Mason was tracking satellite pings? What if he'd hired people? What if someone I trusted was playing both sides? I couldn't afford to guess. I needed to know. So I baited him. I used one of my last clean burner laptops and created a small email trail fake contacts between a new investor group and someone claiming to own pieces of Harrow's oldest intellectual property. I made it look like a potential threat to Mason's past deals. Then I watched. 3 days later, one of the fake names got flagged in a password reset request from a server in Buenos Aires. He was watching. Or someone working for him was. That meant he was still moving. Still thinking. Still dangerous. And that meant I had to go deeper. I needed leverage. I'd already exposed everything public. But Mason's true vulnerability wasn't his money anymore. It was his past, the people he hurt, the people he used, the bodies buried behind non-disclosure agreements and quiet payouts. So I started calling in old favors. I reached out to Kendra Hall, a former operations manager from Harrow Logistics. She'd been fired in 2015 after calling out inventory fraud in one of their southern hubs. Back then she was too scared to fight. She'd signed a settlement deal and disappeared into quiet obscurity. But she had a teenage son now. And a diagnosis, stage 2 lymphoma. Her savings were gone. She was ready to talk. We met in Omaha. Neutral ground. I sat across from her at a truck stop diner on the edge of town. Her hair was thinner. Her voice raspier. But she had fire in her eyes. She gave me what I needed. Back in 2014, Mason had used one of his shell companies to dump dangerous chemical loads into private waste fields in South Texas. Not only illegal, but dangerous, toxic enough to ruin the groundwater of entire rural towns. She had copies of the transport records. I already had the shipping manifests. Together, it was enough to reopen a case. But this time I didn't leak it to the media. I went quiet. I sent it to an investigative agency I trusted. Private. Deep pockets. Funded by a mix of retired lawyers and government watchdogs. I didn't give them my name. I gave them the evidence, fully sourced, and a simple note. He's back. And worse. 3 weeks later the story broke. But not in the US. A French environmental journal published an expose linking Harrow transport to several cancer clusters in South Texas and rural Louisiana. Independent labs backed up the groundwater contamination. Locals started organizing. That's when Mason slipped up. He filed a cease and desist using one of his remaining lawyers. The signature on the filing matched one of his old burner LLCs. He was trying to plug leaks, but all he did was show his hand. That was all I needed. I wasn't the only one watching him now. State attorneys from Texas and Louisiana opened a joint probe. And then I got a call from Sean Buckley. He'd stayed quiet for years after we collapsed Mason's core empire. But he still had connections. Do you know what he's doing now? Sean asked. I told him no. He's going after your family, he said. At first I thought it was a scare tactic. But Sean didn't lie. He didn't need to. He forwarded me a chain of private investigator invoices. All tied to my last name. My cousin in Lincoln. My half-sister in Phoenix. My ex-girlfriend from 10 years ago who'd moved to Michigan and remarried. Mason was tracking every branch I'd ever touched. He couldn't destroy me financially, I'd buried my assets too well. But he wanted to expose me. Make me radioactive. Make anyone I'd ever loved turn against me. This wasn't defense. It was extermination. And that's when the twist came I hadn't planned for. Kendra Hall died. 3 weeks after giving me her records, she collapsed at home. Official cause. Complications from her cancer treatment. But the timing was too perfect. Too sudden. Her son Caleb didn't buy it. He found a half-burned envelope in their fireplace inside. A printed photo of Kendra at our Omaha meeting. Someone had been watching her. Someone wanted to make sure she knew. He called me from her phone. Said he didn't know who else to trust. I want to make them pay, he said. I told him to meet me. Now I had a new problem. A kid barely 17 grieving, angry, and holding on to a death he thought was murder. And he was right. I couldn't just send him away. Not only because I owed Kendra, but because I saw something in his voice. I remembered that voice. It sounded like mine. The day I stood in the back of that ballroom and heard my brother laugh at me. So I told him everything. Not all at once, just the truth in pieces. About Mason. About what I did. About what was coming. And I made him a promise. We were going to finish this. But not for revenge anymore. For Kendra. For the towns he poisoned. For the people who never got a voice. I'm not proud of everything I've done. Some of it crossed lines. Some of it wasn't justice, just revenge, plain and simple. But Mason made this personal. He could have walked away. Could have disappeared and stayed gone. But instead, he declared war. Now he's going to find out what happens when someone like me stops watching. And starts striking back. We spent the next 5 months planning. Caleb stayed with me at the cabin in Montana. I homeschooled him in the art of war, the kind that happens behind closed doors, over encrypted networks and cold paper trails. He was smart, angry but focused. The kind of focus you don't usually see in someone his age. Pain had sharpened him. He didn't want money. He wanted the truth to go public. All of it. And he wanted names. He wanted Mason to be known not as a businessman, not as a victim of cancel culture or government regulation, but as a man who built an empire on lies, blood, and silence. And we were going to give him that. First, we reopened every file I had on Mason, old cases, suppressed news stories, NDAs, corruption, payouts. I cross-referenced them with every known alias he used, every location he had touched since going underground. Caleb helped me sift through old property deeds and shell firms. That's when we found it. A new corporate entity. Stonebird Holdings, registered out of Panama but operating in the U.S. quietly through a Colorado mining project. The CEO? A man named Mark Hansen. No digital footprint before 2022. But the signature on a public permit matched a document from 2013 one Mason had signed under his own name. It was him. Operating in plain sight. Rebuilding. And worse, one of the new projects was in South Texas. Same site as the groundwater contamination. The land had been renamed, cleaned up on paper, but it was the same poison, just repackaged. We needed a big move. A public one. I contacted 3 of the journalists I trusted. 2 of them owed me from past leaks. One was just sick of writing puff pieces. I handed them everything. Proof of rebranded companies. Proof of new environmental violations. Evidence of offshore payments made to state inspectors. Emails, real ones showing Mason had paid to bury the cancer reports tied to his old warehouse sites. We timed the release. First, the local papers in Texas. Then the regional media. Finally, the New York Times picked it up. The headline read, "Empire of Waste. How a disgraced CEO quietly rebuilt a toxic business under a fake name. It exploded." Government hearings were called. Lawmakers who had taken donations from Mason under aliases tried to deny it, then panicked. He had nowhere left to run. And that's when we made the final move. See, Mason still had one clean asset. A trust fund parked under a Cayman entity, tied to a legacy investment in a tech company from the early 2000s. That fund? We couldn't touch it directly. But we didn't need to, because we found the lawyer managing it. A man named Hal Borden. We sent him proof that Mason had used his firm to illegally launder funds through nonprofits, charities meant for hurricane relief. Money rerouted to offshore crypto wallets instead. Heartwarming. He didn't want prison. So he gave us access to Mason's final safe house location, a private estate hidden under a conservation front near Flagstaff, Arizona. Back where it all began. The night we went there, we didn't bring cameras. No crew. Just 2 people and a hard drive full of evidence. I knocked on the door. Mason opened it. He looked smaller, older. The tan was gone. His hair was gray. No guards. No lawyers. Just him. He looked at me, then at Caleb, and for the first time in his life he looked afraid. Not because he thought we'd kill him, but because he knew everything he built was about to be exposed. And this time, there was no press statement that could save him. I handed him a flash drive. "This is everything," I said. "And it's already out there. But I wanted you to see it first. He didn't say a word. He didn't beg. He didn't curse. He just closed the door. The next morning, Mason Harrow was arrested by U.S. Marshals after a sealed indictment was unsealed based on new evidence and public outcry. He was charged with environmental crimes, fraud, money laundering, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, 28 counts. No bail. The footage of him being escorted out of the house in cuffs went viral within hours. His face, once the poster boy for leadership conferences, now a symbol of greed and failure. I didn't celebrate. I stayed quiet. So did Caleb. But we watched. Over the next year, Mason's estates were seized. His grandchildren were removed from school boards and foundations that bore his name. His third ex-wife published a memoir exposing everything. It topped the bestsellers list for 2 months. His great-grandchildren won their legal case to change their last names. Harrow is now considered a disavowed legacy by several institutions. Harvard Business School added a new case to its curriculum. The Fall of Mason Harrow, Legacy, Lies and Lessons. And me? I disappeared again. I left the cabin to Caleb. He earned it. He's not me, he's better. He wants to work in public policy. Says he wants to keep power scared. I believe him. As for me, I don't regret what I did. I wasn't the dreamer. I wasn't the builder. But I watched. And in the end, that's all I needed. Because some empires rot from within. And some, they burn. One piece at a time.